right, well, this is a really big topic, but what I'm going to try to do in 20 minutes is give you kind of an overview of how the brain works and how we store information, because if you can understand this one component of how we integrate information, then it pretty much describes all mental illness and the stress that we go through in our life. So what he didn't say is, most recently I work at a drug and treatment center, drug and alcohol treatment center, Mountain Peak Recovery. And working with addicts is interesting because addiction operates in the same part of our brain as anxiety, PTSD, and regulates the same way. So we can learn a lot by understanding addiction and how our brain works with emotion too. So is anybody here familiar with Dan Siegel's work, Mindsight, Brainstorm? So Dan Siegel is probably one of the most knowledgeable, he's a therapist and a psychiatrist, and he has done a lot of work with studying the mind and on a neurochemical basis, neurobiology, explaining how the brain works. So I'm just going to start by the way he describes the brain, because this is a good way to remember how your brain works. And if you were to think about your hand as your brain, and this is really hard to do holding a mic, but if you were to think about this part as the top of your brain, so this is where we think and we reason and we logic, and your thumb as the limbic system, so this is where your emotion is regulated, and the palm of your hand is your brain base, where basically our fight, fight, freeze response happens. Then what happens is that we have these two parts of our brain. They're basically different. We're on different networks. So this part of our brain, this is the part of our brain that takes over if you're driving down the freeway and suddenly someone slams on their brakes in front of you. You don't have time to think about how many seconds divided by whatever is it going to take me to stop and how much pressure I'm going to apply on my brakes, right? Have you ever thought that? No, nobody? No. Didn't think so. No, because what happens is when something like that stimulates this part of our brain, we basically flip our lid, or this part of our brain, our logical center of our brain, the blood flow shuts down, so it shuts down about 80%, and this part of our brain takes over. And so there is a functional component of why that happens. Unfortunately, this can happen when it's not always functional for us. So when the way that Dan Siegel explains wellness is he talks about this triangle of well-being. So the triangle of well-being, and talking about a healthy, functional person, says that we need to have all of these things integrated in order to be healthy people. So at the top is our relationships, because we are social animals, and besides food and water and shelter, connection and relationships are an essential part of our survival. Second is the brain, and when he talks about the brain, he's talking about the actual physical neurological information that's sent back and forth in our bodies, or physiological response of this part of our body. And then the mind. And what Dan Siegel tried to do is, when he started doing his research, he started looking for a definition of the mind, and found that of all the literature and everything that's sent out here, everybody talks about the mind, but nobody's come up with a definition of what the mind actually is. So what he talks about the mind is basically the flow of information that happens between our relationships and our relationship to the world, and our neurochemistry, and our ability to process, modulate, and modify information. And so what that means is that we have adaptive memory, system, adaptive memory processing. And if I say to you yellow house, your brain automatically associates that with an image. But if I say to you blah, 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 doesn't mean anything necessarily, right? Because our brains come up with symbolic meanings and connecting things, and what is going on neurochemically is our brain links things together and it differentiates. So it's kind of like if you were to imagine your brain as a river. You've got all of these experiences and flow of information that come in together into this river, and your brain integrates that so that you can stop and start information, that you can manage the flow. And that's what allows our brain, when we stop our car really fast, once that experience is over, then we can pause for a minute, we can realize we're safe, and we integrate that experience most of the time. And what happens is this part of the brain sends down a hormone called GABA, and that GABA bathes the limbic system and calms it down and says, okay, everything's okay now, and closes the lid back down. So this is how a functional brain operates. So the problem is sometimes the brain doesn't get fully integrated, or experiences don't get fully integrated. So when experiences don't get integrated, then these things don't work together properly. So we either have chaos over here, or we have rigidity over here. And so early on in life, we develop attachments to our parents, and we figure out on a relational basis where we fit in with the world. So that's the first part of this, is whether our brain is able to integrate is based on our early attachments. And if you were to think about this as, so if we have rigidity and chaos here, and we have some families where things are enmeshed, or things are disconnected emotionally, relationships. Sorry, my handwriting's not all that great. But so if you were to think of this as an axis of where you had rigid over here and chaos over here, some people's personalities are naturally a little bit more rigid or chaotic, and some people are naturally a little bit more distant or a little more close. And so this is what one of my colleagues came up with, what he calls the circle of moderation, or functionality, in which normal can kind of function in this area of axis. So we don't have to be perfectly in the center as far as whether, how we think about things. If you're a financial planner, you might be a little bit more rigid.
So I'm not a very good one.
So you're never a good one, okay. But if you're a numbers person, if you think more on the left side of your brain, and you can, it's okay to some extent, but when you start to get outside of here, then this is where it starts to become dysfunctional. So it gets too rigid, or it's too chaotic, too enmeshed, too disconnected. And this is where we start to lose the integration capacity of the brain, is when we function in here or outside here. So in here, if you think about if your family was always in each other's business, and there's a lot of insecurity about, if you're a Democrat and your mom's a Republican, and that just ends up in a huge fight, because what's happened is that maybe you're a little bit more enmeshed and you have a lot of rigid beliefs, and so your relationships are in this circle because you've linked you link the association of worth and value and who I am with this person's identity. And so it's not differentiated enough. So then we start to get closer to over here. And at the same, the opposite end, where you don't have strong attachments, people are just kind of there, but there's not a lot of emotional, you're here, but I don't necessarily need you to survive. That's not healthy either. And so this starts to get dysfunctional too. And what happens is, it's that word shame. Shame is actually an important part of our adaptive memory process. Shame is useful in helping us to stay connected to society, keeping us from danger. If you go run out in the street naked and you're self-conscious, you're going to be, some negative things are going to happen. So you have that. That's an adaptive, integrative function of shame. However, if you're functioning in here, then what happens is when things are too disconnected, too enmeshed, too rigid, or too chaotic, then we start to develop negative beliefs about ourselves. And instead of processing our experiences, that information and network, instead of going into the river of integration, it gets kind of stuck. Let's say I had a very disconnected, rigid father who it wasn't really emotionally connected, and I'm afraid of disconnection, so I come home from school and I have a report card that has all A's and 1 B, and he says to me, well, why didn't you get all A's? What's wrong with that B? And because I'm in this region, I might start to think, well, I'm no good because I didn't get an A. So what happens to that experience is, instead of fully processing it and integrating it and putting it to rest, that becomes stuck. That belief system gets stuck if I'm not good enough. And so later on down the road, when I'm in a job and my boss calls me in and gives me the 10 things I'm doing right and the 1 thing I'm doing wrong, I don't think I'm good enough, or I feel like I'm underperforming because I'm associating that experience I had with my dad with this experience over here. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, would you say that each one of us is naturally more in one quadrant than another, or would you say our natural state would be in the middle, and moving out of that would be kind of a mutation or something?
Yeah, so naturally, we can be a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more rigid. But the problem is, once we get out to here, if we switch things around, we don't usually go from here to here, we go from here to here. So we go from one extreme to the other extreme. And what Tom noticed, when he's my colleague that came up with this, is that when you talk about abuse, different types of abuse, is that they tended to happen on the outside of the circle of these domains, where there was a lot of enmeshment. Things were enmeshment and things were really rigid. Then physical abuse was more likely to happen. So I'm looking at my circle and I do the opposite than what I have on my paper. Or if things were enmeshed and chaotic, this is where the sexual abuse tends to happen. Where things are rigid and disconnected, emotional or psychological abuse. And where things are, let's see if I have this right. Disconnected and I can't translate things if they're upside down. Let's see, disconnected and chaotic. Yeah, neglect over here. And a lot of times within family systems, people who've grown up in a system that's primarily outside of both of these circles will tell me that, yeah, I had one parent who was over here and one parent that was over here, and it was just all over the place. And so when that happens, there's kind of no basis of, this is what I do to connect, this is what I do to survive, here's kind of my home base. And so our brains are unable to recognize when this part is triggered, when we're safe in the present moment. And so PTSD, what's essentially happening is I have all these associations in here that have never integrated with up here. So something that happens that reminds me of something in the past that brings up that negative belief, brings up those emotions, then I flip my lid and I'm not able to pause before I act. I haven't developed that ability to pause so that I can evaluate the situation, integrate the experience, and close the lid again. So this is where we start to develop dysfunctional relationships, addiction, poor spending habits, depression, anxiety. There is a chemical basis, and our DNA, our physiology sets us up to be at risk for some of this, but our environment also modulates our DNA. So the expression of how our genes are expressed can actually be modulated throughout our lifetime. What? 5 minutes. Okay. So, how we get from out here to in here. I'm trained in a method of therapy called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and basically it's based on this getting those maladaptive memory networks and negative beliefs to integrate in the present so that they don't come up and they don't bug us anymore. We resolve those systems that are keeping us in chaos. And it's anybody familiar with this type of therapy? Have experience? Yeah, it's great. And a lot of research on it has been done on PTSD, but there is some research being done on addiction, depression, and finding it helpful. We actually haven't found a population where it's not effective with. So basically how it was developed is this woman, her name's Francine Shapiro. She was a PhD student studying psychology. She was walking through a park one day and was having a bad day and was ruminating over things in her head, and she happened to look up and was looking at the wind and the trees and was following the movement, and she made a connection, and she noticed that when she looked down that it didn't bother her anymore. She just wasn't bothered by it anymore. So she thought, I wonder what this is. I wonder why that happened. I wonder if I moved my eyes, if that had something to do with resolving the emotion. So she was kind of in the perfect position at the time where she had access to research funding and access to veterans. She started doing this with her friends, to bring up these bad experiences and talk about them, and found that it worked. That these veterans started getting better. And now we know that it's not necessarily just the eye movements, any type of bilateral stimulation where sometimes we use sound, sometimes we use vibrations, but we're alternating both sides of the brain while we're talking about the experience. And what we're doing is we're accessing these misprocessed networks that never integrated, and we're bringing them up in the present to help them to move towards here. And it works relatively quickly in resolving both of those belief systems and those memories, so that once a person resolves it, they can bring it up and it doesn't distress them anymore. It's just a stored memory. So, the other part of what that does is it helps us to recognize, it helps us to look at our internalized shame and to be able to fix our relationships with the world and with people, because we fix those belief systems And so if you think back to that triangle well-being, when we fix those relationships, it also fixes the flow of information where things are not flooding and things are not too stopped, because we're working with both the mind, the belief, or the brain, the belief systems, that have a lot to do with relationships. We're putting it together. So there's brain integrates in all different kinds of ways. Like the EMDR is working with the bilateral, but physical movement, sounds, binaural sounds, even just the practice and awareness of what a healthy relationship looks like, so correcting our relationships in the present are other ways in what can promote healing in the brain. So that's a lot of information in a condensed amount of time. But I guess I'm out of time, so thank you.
You have 10 minutes for Q&A.
Oh, okay.
How would you recommend, I've been working on rewiring myself, and so, but I haven't done it with any kind of EMDR technique, although I just hadn't thought of it, for a long time. Haven't had an EMDR therapist, but I just thought that it's just a matter of time, and, I mean, how would you recommend that?
Well, so the problem is, it's not just a matter of time, it's a matter of processing.
Yeah.
Because when things get stored incorrectly in the brain doesn't recognize time. And so when things come up, with people with PTSD especially, it's when that's triggered, it's as if it's happening right now. And until that gets reprocessed and desensitized, then it's always going to be right now.
Would you say that a personality disorder is, in a sense, its own kind of PTSD?
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of research on that, and with complex trauma, and a lot of women, especially with personality disorders, have a history of complex trauma. And so, yeah, it's that lack of being able to integrate this part of the brain and this part of the brain, so it's constantly getting flipped.
What kinds of psychological problems would you say that this treatment is useful in?
Well, we know for sure for PTSD, but for addiction, personality disorders, anxiety, depression, pretty much we haven't found the population that it doesn't work with. I mean, there always are treatment failures, but it's a pretty effective and pretty quick form of therapy although most of the research has been done with PTSD. Say that as a disclaimer. I know that there is a big study in Germany right now with addiction and desensitizing addicts and reducing cravings that they're finding a lot of success with as well.
So I know it's a lot of trauma, especially if it's early childhood trauma or just in general, it's easy for our brains to associate permanent block it so you don't remember specifically what happened. So in those instances, when you do have PTSD from some past trauma but you don't know what it is, you're being triggered by things. But how do you integrate it if you don't know what it is?
Well, so the interesting thing is, a lot of times when we start, we'll start with whatever's in the present. So somebody might come in with something that happened in the last week, and I don't know why I'm getting triggered. And as we start to make those changes, it'll uncover connections that you weren't aware of. So it might say, well, you were triggered by your boss last week, but can you think back, or can you feel back to a time where earlier on in your childhood, and we try to get to the earliest memory. That's not always possible. So, but the thing is about processing memories is we don't have to have the whole entire memory to resolve it. I've worked with people where they know something happened, they have a psychological and a physiological response, and they might have a few pieces of information. And we work with what's there, because what's important is the misstored information. We don't have to have all the pieces. We know that memory is distorted. We know that when you have trauma, that most of the time victim accounts are not accurate, because when that's triggered, and we're making associations that may or may not be accurate. And so whether it's accurate or not doesn't matter. Whether we have all the information doesn't matter. Sometimes when we're processing it, more information will come out. People will have recall things that wasn't there before, but we don't have to try and dig up memories.
Would it be more a matter of finding the belief rather than the memory itself?
Yeah, it's the negative belief is what we're after, actually. So what causes distress is that we have the event and then we develop a negative belief, the negative cognition, and so that's what causes the distress is because we have this negative belief associated with this experience. And so that is what we're after by putting those two things together and reprocessing it and replace the negative belief with a positive belief. So it's no longer, it's not, maybe you won't think about it and think, wow, that was great. Because there is we call it ecological soundness that, if I was in a war and I killed somebody, I may not necessarily be okay with the fact that I killed somebody, but when I go back and think about it now, it doesn't, it's this huge level of distress. Because we've processed and integrated this experience.
See, I think two questions. One is, so this is you're talking about PTSD, temporary traumatic events. Can this also help us with improving habits, better self-discipline?
Absolutely. And what we find, a lot of us have negative beliefs that maybe aren't necessarily traumatic, but due to normal life and how we interpreted experience, and maybe we even had great parents, but something, early on in childhood, we had an experience that caused some emotional distress. We developed a negative belief, and we don't realize how that contributes to dysfunction in everyday life. And so for a lot of people, even not with PTSD, when we start to look at that, they'll go back and say, oh yeah, when I was 6, this happened, and this is why I do this now. And so it helps to resolve a lot of those things.
So the follow-up question is, how long does treatment take? So if someone, whether it's childhood trauma or bad habit or whatever else, are we talking months of therapy?
Not necessarily.
A week or two?
Of course, everybody is different.
Right.
Everybody processes different, and a lot of it has to do with how many internal resources do you have in the present. So do you have good relationships in the present? Do you have a job? Are your basic needs met?
Okay.
If all of those things are functional in the present, it's probably going to take a less amount of time. Where somebody that maybe doesn't have all that, I'm going to have to spend a lot of time helping them to build resources before we even get into reprocessing. And so we don't, it's not necessarily, we don't come into therapy saying it's going to take this amount of sessions, but studies do show that this type of processing is faster in most cases than exposure therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and traditional therapies. A lot of times within 3 to 4 sessions, we're getting through some major of the work. If it's, we're talking about simple trauma, if we're talking about long-term, that can vary.
So if somebody asked me to hold my lungs, to hold my breath for like 20 seconds, I can do that with no problem. But if you ask me to hold my mind and not think for 20 seconds, it's interesting. It's much more difficult than holding my lungs. And it sounds like, you can think all day long about what went wrong in your life and why, all day long, and never resolve it, but it sounds like looking up at a tree and pausing and holding your mind, or listening to something, holding your mind that way. So is that the practice that leads the edge to the breakthrough?
That's kind of the idea is, because if we get, reflection can be helpful in helping us to figure things out, but if we stay in reflection too long, then we stop the flow of processing and we get stuck there and we operate in that world of everything is this way, and that's where we get too rigid. Where looking up a tree, being mindful allows us to access that adaptive information processing network and to heal linkages and create new linkages.
There is more to it than mindfulness though, right? The movement of the eyes itself is accessing different parts of the brain, right?
Sure. Yeah, the first step though is mindfulness, and then integrating new experiences and creating new associations. That mindfulness, that ability to take a pause is what allows us to take a step back and to create that space for that change to happen.
Now, it's my understanding that PTSD is really stubborn and hard to treat. You mentioned a little bit, like this works, what else works and what doesn't work. How hard is it to treat?
I don't think PTSD is hard to treat. Sometimes I find that I work a lot with borderline personality disorder, so a lot of the clients that I treat that have those features, their whole attachment and their whole identity concept has been steeped in this dysfunction or being sick. So sometimes what I have to do with that person, and what that tells me is that they have very few resources for what that healthy triangle, they have very few resources to relate to. So, and a lot of it's that fear of disconnection, and the way that I've learned to connect is through my trauma. And if I don't have my trauma, or if I don't have this pain, then what am I gonna have? Am I gonna be disconnected? And that's kind of the core belief that comes up. So a lot of times, we may spend like a year or 2 years doing this before we even get into trauma, is where I help that person to visualize, what would it be like to have, and we can do this through EMDR too, because we do kind of future template building. And so what would it look like if you had a relationship that was based on going to the movies? Would it, just little simple things, what would that be like? What would that feel like? And we spend a lot of time helping the person to build those internal resources, and which has to also be reinforced with external experiences. So, I'm done.
Out of time.